Hey, my name is Jacob, and I have a question for you today. Is architecture a manifestation of the culture around it, or can it exist solely as an idea on its own? You know what I think? I think it's nearly impossible for architecture to not represent the culture around it in some way. K. Michael Hayes seems to agree with me to an extent, saying that it's pretty obvious to see that architecture is a little bit of both. He then looks at the famous works of German architect Mies van der Rohe to help illustrate his point, and I think I'll be doing the same. But before this, we need to look at both sides of the argument, right? The cultural side says that culture remains changing, but architecture doesn't. Architecture might remain not forever, but it does remain a bit longer than the culture around it, right? So by this, the culture around the architecture will have disappeared by the time the building is ready to be demolished. What this means is that when someone looks at the building, but the culture around it no longer exists, there's almost no way to tell what the original intent for the building was. However, that doesn't mean that the form side of the argument is the winner either. An architecture, even when built purely on form, will say something about the culture around it. I'll get to this a little bit later, but Mies's works exemplify this beautifully. Now, to get back on track, we'll look at what society thought about the city in the early 1900s. Everything was changing and people were overloaded with information, specifically in Berlin. Seeing buildings, people, and society itself evolve at such a rapid pace, there was World War I, and the city felt like a whirlwind of information you couldn't understand, and everything was detached from everything you knew. It was a chaos, and many forms of art pieces at the time reflect themes like these, such as the Scream, and the movement of Dadaism, trying to embrace chaos by making an order out of it. Knowing this is pretty important when taking the next step, because Mies's works created an architecture that answered this chaos. The form was completely irrelevant to the culture around it, yet it was relevant. See, what I mean by this is that the city was so chaotic. It had all these facades and these walls that people could see information from, information on. And then Mies comes in with these buildings, with these glass curtain walls that all they do are reflecting, refracting. And when you step inside, when you step close to this building, you're welcomed with a sense of silence. Something that detaches you from the city, from the chaos. Everything suddenly quiets down here. A great example of this is this idea for the Alexanderplan. The outline of the brief favored a circular plan, a circular form, but Mies went with the silent, straight, streamlined architecture. Very modern in shape, but the important thing about this is that look at the city. It's so chaotic. There's so much around there, and then you have these entryways into the middle of these rectangular, straight-faced buildings, and in the middle you find silence. A building like this really has no relation to the culture around it, but at the same time it does. And this is what I mean by it's almost impossible for architecture to not represent the culture around it. You could plot this series of buildings almost anywhere and it would still make sense. Maybe you'd have to shrink them down to size a bit better so that it fits on the plan. But the form itself, the idea can stay the same wherever you are. I think this is one of the strongest cases that I can use. Because even when seemingly nothing is related to the culture, it still shows the culture once you see the building next to it. And from that you can see that the building has been created almost as an answer to the culture. Maybe it didn't derive its form directly from the cultural roots, but the surroundings still play a huge impact on how the form was built.